Hey everyone, this is my response to the Week 5 discussion question in which we are to discuss why the U.S. chose not to change its foreign policy in the Middle East, especially after it became apparent, especially in 1967 and 1973, that Israel would not comply with ceasefire agreements or with peace agreements unless it was apparent to Israel that that the U.S. was not going to provide support. It's become pretty apparent to me, reading both in Jacob's book and in the book that we're reading right now, The Peace Process, that changing U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East wasn't going to happen overnight. And that is primarily because there was not a general consensus on how to approach the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, I'm going to preface my discussion by saying that I have not read that much on this subject, even though I find it absolutely fascinating. And I'm really enjoying reading this book right now. It's very, finding a lot of good information in it. I am only basing my thoughts primarily on the reading from these two books that we've read in the class. But reading the first 4 chapters in The Peace Process, the author really lays the groundwork for the foreign policy arena in the Nixon administration. And it became very clear to me that the focus, Nixon's focus wasn't primarily on the Middle East. I think that's how you pronounce the author. The author notes that Nixon is primarily focused first upon the Soviet Union, the U.S.'s role in the Cold War, and then later on in his administration, he's more focused on Vietnam and strengthening relationship with China. So, in some ways, the Middle East kind of got put on the back burner, and it wasn't. I think that's apparent because you see, and the author even mentions it in his book, in a couple instances, Nixon was concerned about other events going on, so he would give the brunt of the policy work to Henry Kissinger. And as we read again, Kissinger had very different views on how to handle the Arab-Israeli conflict than did the State Department and William Rogers, the Secretary of State. And I think that much of the foreign policy during this time was almost like a war between the two sides in the government. There's Henry Kissinger, and then there's Nixon on one side, and then on the other side there's the State Department and William Rogers. And while these two groups share some of the same approaches to the Middle East problem, they disagree on a lot of other approaches. Nixon and Kissinger were more hardliners. They emphasized the role that the Soviet Union played in much of the conflict in the Middle East. And Rogers and the people at the State Department said, much of the conflict that's going on there right now comes from that region. It's not caused by the Soviet Union. And the State Department and Rogers said, or promoted a plan of mediation, trying to find the common ground or the middle ground between Israel and the Arabs. And in Nixon's response to the Six-Day War in 1967, and then the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, that seems to be largely his approach. He doesn't really want to get involved. He's obviously reluctant by not providing the Israelis arms, the second they ask for it. But nor does he shut them off completely. He obviously aligns himself with the Israelis, but there never seems to be a clear consensus in the American government on how to approach the Middle East problem. And those are my initial thoughts for this week. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your responses. So I will talk to everyone later.